Our next speaker is Professor Brian Walker of Queen's University Belfast, who is going to speak to us about Southern Unionists. He is a very distinguished senior historian whose work is perhaps best known to you for his 2 volumes of election results in the 19th and 20th century in the series The New History of Ireland, and they are 2 volumes which I probably consult once a week at least. So I'm very deeply grateful to you for that, and it's a great pleasure to invite you now to address this audience. Thank you, Brian.
I have to say, Mr. Bertie Ahern referred to the fact that I was stopped on the bus this morning. I was coming from Belfast, and the guard at Seán got on just across the border between County Down and County Louth, and asked for our passports. So I felt like saying I was shocked that me moving from one part of Ireland to another should be asked to identify myself. But I thought if I had done that, he might well have taken me away and brought me to Dundalk police station and interrogated me for being so smart, so I let it go anyway. So I'm very glad to be here today. Delighted to speak here at this seminar. I congratulate the Reform Group on their initiative in bringing together such a diverse range of speakers to discuss this important event. Recently, we've seen a number of articles and TV programmes on the 1918 general election. These have been very interesting. At the same time, I think that occasionally this coverage has been rather simplistic, including some plain errors. I still can't believe that I heard in the advance publicity for the very interesting programme last night on the 1918 general election, I heard it stated on RTE time and time again, in 1918, the only ever 32 county general election in Irish history took place. Quite extraordinary. I can only suggest they look at my book on Irish electors. I'll show there are at least another 29 in the previous 120 years. I believe that there are other dimensions or nuances that are worth exploring. Hopefully we'll be looking at some of these today. Now what I want to do is first of all say a few words about myself, my own background, then make some brief general comments about the general election, and finally I will look at the position of Southern Unionists at this time. In 1918, J.R. Lonsdale, a cousin of my mother's grandfather, Robert Orr, was elected as Unionist MP for Mid-Armagh. He succeeded his brother, John Lonsdale, who had been the former MP for Mid-Armagh and Secretary of the Irish Unionist Parliamentary Party, 1903 to 17. My father's father, my grandfather, Carlisle Walker, signed the Ulster Covenant in 1912. My father was born in Belfast and educated at Trinity College, Dublin. He became a Church of Ireland clergyman and served as an army chaplain and a D-Day 1 veteran. In our Church of Ireland family home, St. Patrick's Day was always more important than the 12th of July, probably because my father became rector of Saul Parish outside Downpatrick, where St. Patrick had his first church. My father was a loyal British citizen and a proud Irishman. I see myself in a similar light, British and Irish. I studied history in Trinity and originally researched 19th and 20th century Irish elections. I spent most of my academic career at Queen's, in the Politics School and the Institute of Irish Studies. I'm pleased to be here to talk about the 1918 general election. I want to make some general comments. It's been called, the 1918 general election has been called, as in Thursday's Irish Times, the most important and momentous election in Ireland. I accept that it was important, but I'm not happy to call it the most important or momentous, except perhaps in a negative sense. The key general election for electoral politics in modern Ireland was the 1885 general election. This was when, for the first time, all householders, all adult male householders could vote, and Irish politics emerged clearly as based on a division of the national question anchored in denominational divisions. As John Coakley has observed, this general election, that's the 1885 general election, marks the birth of modern Irish politics. The Nationalist Party, was based on the Catholic community very largely, with key Catholic clerical support, while the Unionist Party, with Orange Order support, was based very largely in the Protestant community. In succeeding decades, this polarity was challenged, as by T.W. Russell in the North in the early 1900s, and by William O'Brien in the 1910 general elections. In the end, however, such challenges were unsuccessful. These divisions over nationality and religion remained at the heart of politics in Ireland during the 20th century. The outcome of the 1918 general election did nothing to change this picture. Basically, the result confirmed this political state. It was a victory for confrontation rather than accommodation. On the one side, there was sharp conflict within the nationalist and Catholic community about how their nationalist agenda should best be promoted. Electoral competition between Sinn Féin and the Irish Parliamentary Party resulted in a victory for Sinn Féin and its advanced Republican aims. The Labour movement was sidelined. The violence which eventually followed between Republicans and British forces, and then between different Republican wings in the Civil War, would leave a dire legacy. Many Southern Unionists were badly affected by this violence. On the other side, in the North, there was sharp conflict in 1918 in the Unionist and Protestant community, especially in Belfast, where the Unionist Party faced a strong trade union movement and independent Labour candidates. This challenge was successfully repelled at the 1918 general election. In early 1919, however, a massive strike in the shipyards revealed the depth of this protest. Subsequently, however, such class unity would be lost over the next few years, and in the changing political scene and ensuing violence, many Northern Catholics / nationalists lost their jobs and homes. The conflict and violence of the revolutionary year cemented these divisions over religion and nationality, North and South, I'm afraid. In 1918, however, there was actually one group which sought to escape such political straitjackets. This was to be found among Southern Unionists. And I want to talk about these people. I take care not to describe them as Anglo-Irish, which I believe to be a derogatory term. In the early 20th century, they referred to themselves as Irish. They were Irish, but also British, and loyal to the Crown and supporters of the Union. The name Anglo-Irish was rarely used by themselves or even by their enemies at this point, but this changes. Writing in 1926, Stephen Quinn, a Protestant who had actually been a nationalist MP, remarked, "I was brought up to think of myself Irish without question or qualification, but the new nationalism prefers to describe me and the like of me as Anglo-Irish." Lily Yeats, sister W.B. Yeats, expressed her annoyance at this development. "We are far more Irish than all the saints and martyrs, Parnell, Pearse, Maudgon, De Valera, and no one ever thinks of them as Anglo-Irish." In a lecture in 1933, historian Edmund Curtis rejected the term because it seemed to separate them in some way from the Irish nation. It implied they were not wholly Irish. In 1911, Unionists North and South were united in opposition to Home Rule. Ulster Unionists had their own organisation, the Ulster Unionist Council. Southern Unionists were involved in the Irish Unionist Alliance, which was an all-Ireland body, but was run by Southerners and based in Dublin. The introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill in 1911, however, led to the signing of the Ulster Covenant and formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force to oppose Home Rule. The idea of partition now emerged, first as a strategy to thwart Home Rule, and then as an answer to the conflict between Unionist and Nationalist claims. This idea did not find favour among Southern Unionists, who feared it would leave them a small minority in a Southern state. In 1916, following the Easter Rising, Southern Unionists helped undermine efforts by the government to give Home Rule to Ireland, with the exclusion of 6 northern counties. They were against partition. By 1918, however, some Southern Unionists had come round to the view that Home Rule was inevitable and that a settlement with parliamentary nationalists was a good idea. At the Irish Convention, 1917 to 18, members of the Irish Unionist Association, led by Viscount Middleton, agreed to a Home Rule arrangement for Ireland with rights for Unionists, such as an upper house and with partition. They agreed this with members of the Irish Parliamentary Party. This idea, however, did not find favour with Ulster Unionists and some nationalists and came to nothing. Now, Middleton and others supported this accommodation. There are other unionists, I have to say, whoever did not approve of such accommodation, of accepting the idea that they should have Home Rule, and they form another group, the Southern Unionist Committee. Following the armistice, on the 14th of November, it was announced that the 27th of November, Parliament would be dissolved and a general election would be held on the 14th of December. The coalition government issued a joint manifesto signed by Lloyd George and Bonar Law. They noted how Ireland was, and I quote, rent by contending forces, end of quote, and stated that they would seek to settle the Irish question on the basis of self-government. They don't describe what they mean by self-government, but in this manifesto they rule out two things. One is complete severance of Ireland from the British Commonwealth, obviously some sort of republic, they're completely against that, and also the forcible submission of the 6 counties of Ulster to a Home Rule Parliament. But what the solution was to be, that wasn't made clear. In the case of the Irish Unionists, they faced not only nationalists and Sinn Féin, but also tensions in their own ranks. I'm referring to Southern Unionists. This led to a decision by Sir Edward Carson, MP for Dublin University, to give up his seat and stand for a Belfast working class seat at Duncairn. This was not an amicable parting of the ways for Sir Edward and his Dublin constituency. He was now seen by them as representing Ulster rather than all Ireland. In a letter to the press, Carson stated that Provost Mahaffey, quote, had never been a supporter of mine, and indeed his actions at the convention was one of the elements that led me to the conclusion that I did, end of quote. A reference to Mahaffey's support for convention proposals which Carson had opposed. In the north, the Ulster Unionist Party faced the rise of a strong labour and trade movement. To combat this challenge, the party set up the Ulster Labour Unions Association, which put forward 3 candidates. Strong appeals were made for unionist unity. Within Southern Unionism, there were also divisions between those who were prepared to accept some form of Home Rule with protection for unionists and those who were still completely opposed to Home Rule. In the 26 counties, candidates came forward in Cork City, Donegal East, Dublin City, the St Stephen's Green Division, and Dublin County in the Rathmines, Pembroke and South Divisions. I think there was also a unionist standing in a Monaghan seat. 2 unionists plus an independent unionist and an independent nationalist stood for Dublin University. The election addresses and speeches of these candidates make interesting reading. In his address for the Rathmines seat, Sir Maurice Dockrell declares himself a strong supporter of the legislative union between Great Britain and Ireland. This was what you'd expect from a unionist. He states his belief that the interests of the country are bound up with those of Great Britain and the Empire, and this is the best future for Ireland to remain like that. He declares opposition to any measure involving the partition of Ireland or the coercion of our fellow countrymen in Ulster. He then urges for support for other measures such as decent dwellings. I believe that's still a problem down here. And the welfare of returning soldiers. In South Dublin, Sir Thomas Robinson declares his opposition and coercion in Ulster similarly. Now, how do they reconcile these two things? They're opposed to partition and they're opposed to the coercion of Ulster. Well, an editorial in the Irish Times, the 25th of November, describes what they really say, what they're really arguing is they're against partition. But the only way really to prevent that is to avoid coercion of Ulster Unionists. And this must involve nationalists moderating their demands for an Irish Republic. That's how you reconcile those two things. Other Unionists expressed different views. In the Dublin University contest, independent Unionist Robert Woods called for a settlement by consent while expressing opposition to partition. One of his opponents, however, W.M. Jellett, declared his outright opposition to Home Rule for any part of Ireland and declared that the only way to prevent partition was to maintain the Union unchanged. He challenged Middleton's efforts to come up with a compromise. In North Monaghan, on the other hand, M.E. Knight declared that he'd been assured by Carson that before a bill was introduced in Parliament that would exclude any part of Ulster from the United Kingdom, he would bring it to the Unionists of the area affected. Obviously concerned that if they go for a six-county Ulster, then Monaghan Unionists are going to be left out of this. Results for the general election were declared on the 14th of December for all constituencies, apart from the university seats, which came a few days later. They showed that Sinn Féin had won 73 seats, compared to 6 for the Irish Parliamentary Party. The Unionists, and I think sometimes this has been hasn't been picked up, they achieved their biggest victory since 1880. Their seats went up from some 16, 17 to 26. In the North, Unionists won 23 seats, including 3 Labour Unionist candidates. In the South, a Unionist and an independent Unionist, Robert Woods, were elected for Dublin University along with Sir Maurice Dockrell for Rathmines. In 4 other southern constituencies, Unionist candidates received over 4,000 votes but were unsuccessful. Elsewhere in Great Britain, their allies in the Conservative Party, who are now part of the coalition government, they saw an increase in their numbers from 221 seats to 357 out of 612. In the aftermath of the general election, the division which had emerged between those Unionists who wanted some sort of accommodation over Home Rule and those who were opposed to this led to a split in the Irish Unionist Alliance, with the conciliatory element under Middleton leaving to found a new organisation, the Unionist Anti-Partition League. In October 1919, that's nearly a year later, Lloyd George established a committee under Walter Long, a former South Dublin MP and leader of the Irish Unionist Party in the early part of the century, to bring forward new proposals for the self-government of Ireland. The Middleton Group now played an important role in the work that led to the Government of Ireland Act, which established Northern and Southern Parliaments. Of course, this arrangement was ineffective in the South, where the War of Independence now raged. In July 1921, a truce was called, and subsequent negotiations led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 6th of December 1921 and the new Irish Free State Constitution. Southern Unionists played a part in bringing about the truce, but they had little influence in later developments, namely the treaty and the Constitution. Some Southern Unionists felt betrayed by these changes, but the bulk of Southern Unionists accepted the treaty and the new Constitution. On the 11th of December 1921, the Church of Ireland Bishop of Dublin, Dr. Gregg, Archbishop of Dublin, in a sermon stated, "We may not like the facts. Many of us had no desire for a change in the Constitution, but it concerns us all to offer to the Irish state, so shortly to be constituted, our loyalty and goodwill." A meeting of the Board of Trinity on the 10th of December 1921 supported the new settlement and declared its belief that in the building up of happier conditions in Ireland, Trinity men should take an active and sympathetic part. End of quote. The years of the War of Independence and the Civil War were a time of very mixed fortunes for Southern Unionists. R.B. McDowell has pointed out that from 1918, Unionist as a political label was being supplemented or superseded by loyalist. Most Protestants were loyalists, as were many Catholics, such as members of the RIC and former members of the British Army. These people often served as magistrates and had sympathy for Crown forces, which made them targets for the IRA. Many loyalists suffered boycott or intimidation at this time. Matters became worse in the lawless state of the country in early 1921 and during the Civil War, especially at the hands of the irregulars. Loyalists suffered due to their politics, their property, or their religion. RIC members were killed and many were exiled. Nearly 200 country houses were destroyed between 1919 and 1923. Violence or the threat of violence caused large numbers to flee the country. In February 1923, the Catholic Bishop of Cork described how, and I quote, "Protestants have suffered severely during the period of the Civil War in the South," and he urged that charity knows no bounds. So that was one side of their experience at this time. At the same time, however, the early years of the new state, the new southern state, saw efforts by government to reconcile members of the Protestant and former Unionist community to the new state. In Dáil, Éireann, in September 1922, Kevin O'Higgins declared, "It comes well from us, the majority, to make a generous adjustment to show that these people are regarded not as alien enemies, not as planters, but that we regard them as part and parcel of this nation, and that we wish them to take their share of its responsibilities." End of quote. The Constitution, the Free State Constitution, made no special allowance for minorities, but the first Irish Free State Senate, formed in late 1922, included 16 former Southern Unionists, nominated by W.T. Cosgrave, head of the government, and another 7 Protestants who were elected. Elaine Byrne has pointed out, the Senate performed a critical role in inaugurating, legitimising and consolidating many of the institutions of government. End of quote. The role of these former Unionists, many experienced businessmen and professional people, were very important for the new state. I want to end now by comment on 2 people from this period and show how they actually have a relevance for today with our efforts at reconciliation. The 2 people I want to talk about very briefly is the Earl of Farnham and Major Jack Gorman, MC. Now, the Earl of Farnham was the leader of the Cavan Unionists in 1920-21. And when the new arrangements came about that Cavan was being left out of the new state in the north, he was very disappointed. He regarded this as a betrayal, and he spoke out against it in Parliament. Now, the Farnhams remain on in Cavan until 1900, until the year, they remain on for the next 100 years, until the year 2000. In 1942, the Earl lost his son and heir. He's buried not in Cavan, but he's buried in North Africa, where he died at the Battle of El Alamein. However, he had been married, this son, and he had a child, a small boy. This boy then he succeeds his grandfather, becomes the Earl of Farnham. The family then sell their estate in the year 2000 on his death. Now, you may remember in the year, 2011, I think it is, Queen Elizabeth comes to Ireland and she makes these reconciliatory gestures in the Garden of Remembrance and at the National War Memorial. What you may not have noticed was in her shadow was someone else. It was Lady Farnham. She's a lady in waiting to the Queen. So she returned on that occasion and she took part in those reconciliatory gestures at that time. The second person I want to talk about is Major Jack Gorman. In the year 2005, there was a photograph in the Irish Times of 2 men standing in front of Galway Cathedral. There had been a service there to remember those who died in the First World War from Galway. One was Eamon O'Keefe and the other was Sir John Gorman. Now, who are these 2 people? Well, Eamon O'Keefe, you know, was a Fianna Fáil TD. He was also grandson of Eamon de Valera, 1916 rising leader. Sir John Gorman, MC, was a Unionist member of the Assembly, a Catholic Unionist member of the Assembly. He was a decorated army officer and police officer. He was the son of Major Jack Gorman, MC. Major Jack Gorman was the last adjutant of the RIC barracks at Phoenix Park. And Sir John in his memoirs recounts how that in about April 1922, his father handed over the barracks to the Irish Army led by Michael Collins. And I put a reference to this in a recent book that I wrote, and it was evidence of reconciliation today, and how people from this tortured past had now come together on this event. And my proofs of my book came back from the printer, and this was the final story in my book, and there's a bit of a gap in the page, and I thought to myself, well, that's a wonderful story. I wonder what Collins said when he walked through the barracks door. I go back to the newspapers and look it up, you see. So I went back to the newspapers to look up this event. But to my horror, when I looked up the newspaper, I discovered that this was incorrect. That in fact, the RIC barracks in April 1922 was not handed over to the Irish Army, it was handed over to the British Army. It was our last depot. They brought troops back from Galway and Cork, and they had them there before they took down to the ship. So the story was untrue. I then thought to myself, well, obviously, I discovered the barracks was handed over in October to the Irish Army. So I thought to myself, well, I'll go and look that up. But as I'm turning the newspaper, I suddenly realised there's no point in me doing this. Michael Collins couldn't possibly have been there in October 1922, for a reason I think you all know. Now, at this point, I was very concerned because I now thought that maybe this story was completely untrue. So I go and pick out a copy of Tom's Directory for 1922. But it is true that Major Jack Gorman was indeed the last adjutant of the RIC barracks at Phoenix Park. So I was very relieved about that. So I removed the bit, obviously, about Collins. But anyway, I then went back to look at it again, and I looked up the newspaper for this occasion in April 1922. And suddenly I spotted a photograph. And it was of two men on this occasion. One was an army officer and one was a policeman. And the policeman was an RIC man. And the army man with a cigarette in his hand was Lieutenant R. Collins of a British Army regiment. So it was true. It was true. His father had handed over the barracks to Mr. Collins, but not just the bold Michael. However, I think you'll agree that this story of the photograph in 2005 of these two men, descendant of a 1916 rebel, descendant of an RIC officer, standing together to honour the men of Galway who died in the First World War, I think was very symbolic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that. And we now have about 10 minutes or so for a few quick questions or comments. And when I say quick, I mean quick. I don't want any speeches from the floor. If somebody has a quick comment or a question, it's only fair to everybody else to give everybody a chance to participate. So do I have a volunteer to start with? Yes.
I just want to question that, and I asked you already. You know the Senate debates at the 2016, the 100 years, they were on the television during the day, and all the historians were there. McDowell was there, they were all there. And it was about the former North of Ireland. And it was a lecture on the whole period, Carson. And I think that you did give the lecture. And I've been thinking of it the last 2 years. And it was the most brilliant lecture. And I would like to compliment you on the really, really good version of it. Thank you very much.
Very good. Yeah.
Just one comment, and probably applies to our first two speakers. Not very long ago, a famous French historian was asked the question to give some interpretation of the lessons and consequences of the French Revolution. And he turned around to the questioner and he says, "Can you ask me that question in another 300 or 400 years?" The relevance of us today trying to interpret something that's happened. Because to me, all history is an intertwining of trades, and it's fluid, and it keeps going.
Okay,
so what we can do is we can learn lessons, but it still moves on.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
Just a very quick, actually something to do with Mr. Bruton said earlier, which might be relevant to what you said. One comment that he made that struck me very much, that the sectarian divide is probably deeper now than it was 100 years ago. And secondly, just the election of Joe Devlin in 1918, in fact it was the only time in history that Dev was beaten in an election.
Charles?
I wonder if it's correct to label all the Royal Irish Constabulary people as loyalists. So a lot of them would have been nationalists, and of course they were the terrible victims of the murder campaign throughout 1919, which was condemned by Sinn Féin local councillors at the time.
Thank you for that. Yes?
In view of the gentleman's comments there, what do you think is the definition of republicanism in the 21st century?
Okay, I'm going to throw that at the panel.
I don't really know how to answer that one, except to say that I do think it is different for different people. I mean, republicanism is not necessarily a dirty word. It depends on how you interpret it. I mean, establishing a republic is not a bad thing. It can often be how you go about it that can be problematic. So the aspiration in 1918 to establish a republic was not, it was not a bad aspiration. But it's also important to remember that even Sinn Féin, when they were using that word republic, were selective about where they were using it. They certainly wouldn't have used it in good old Edward Carson's constituency or in other areas of Ulster. So it depends on how you interpret, would be my answer.
Thank you. Well, a number of points. Charles makes a very good point. I'm quite sure most of these RSA men probably were of a nationalist background, and that didn't save them, of course, when they suffered this violence. As to whether or not things are worse today, I'm not sure, because on the political front, we do have the 1998 agreement, and I think it's very important, principle of consent. So on the thorny question of unionism v nationalism, we have found a way to manage that quite successfully. Now, unfortunately, in 1918, they weren't able to do that, and people took up tough lines on the issues. So I do think we have advanced today.
Do you not think, Brian, it has broken down again with the failure of the executive to reform?
Well, yes. I mean, I take your point, and things are very tense at the moment within the north, and between north and south, and between Ireland and Britain. Yes, that is correct. Things are bad, but I hope this is only temporary. I hope we will bounce back on that.
Okay. Further questions? Yes.
Yeah, was the 1918 election really a battle between constitutional nationalism and physical force republicanism? And physical force republicanism, one with disastrous results which have continued for the past 100 years.
Well, that depends on what constituency that you're looking at, because there was a couple of three-way contests between Unionists, constitutional nationalists, and republicanism, or Sinn Féin, and the Irish Party. Probably in most of the three southern provinces it was to a large degree, because there wasn't the great variety of unionist candidates in the southern provinces. But in Ulster it would have been a very different story. And the island hasn't been partitioned at this stage, so if you look at it in an All-Ireland context, no, not necessarily between republic or home rule. But there was so many other factors going on during that time as well that played into this whole story as well. And the end of the Great War would have been one of them, and even this idea of abstention, and the fact that there was a whole new other avenue for the likes of Sinn Féin to go down, which was to appeal to the Paris Peace Conference as opposed to the Imperial Parliament. Gave kind of words to use in election campaigns that they could never possibly fulfil in the end, and they never did fulfil in the end of the day either. So I think it's another lesson in the learning of what's promised in election campaigns doesn't necessarily materialise when the people are elected.
I think that might be a good note on which to pause. We all need a little bit of sustenance at this stage. We've had a very interesting morning. Can I just make one point before we conclude, just picking up Brian's paper on Southern Irish Protestants. There is a book, a collection of essays on Southern Irish Protestants post-independence, in the process of being prepared at the moment and due to be published by Cork University Press in March of next year, entitled Protestant and Irish, and edited by Ian Dalton and Dr. Ian Dalton and Dr. Ida Millen. So that's something to look forward to in the new year. So if you get a book token for Christmas, keep it until March and by the Cork University Press. I need to declare a personal interest. I have an essay in it, but I doubt if that will give me any royalties. Okay, we're going to start again at 2 o'clock. Mert wants to say something.
Sorry, Felix, I have a ticket here for the speakers and the chairperson for dinner, and I haven't given it out to some of them. They might come and tell me.
Okay, well, that's great. I'd love to get a ticket for. All right, 2 o'clock.